Okay. This erased. Oops. Wrong one. So chapter 11 is the landlord-tenant chapter, and this is one of the last chapters of big information that has absolutely no math whatsoever in it. As we move forward, I warned you, or promised you, depending on your perspective on math, that the second half of the class is very math heavy. And so we're going to start that today, because even with chapter 12, we'll pretty quickly get into math heavy stuff. But chapter 11 does not have any. So for those of you who need that one last breather without math, enjoy it while it lasts, because here it is. Landlord-tenant law is almost certainly going to be on the North Carolina specific section of the exam, because landlord-tenant law varies tremendously state by state. There's very few questions that you could be asked from a landlord-tenant perspective that would be on a national section, because you just don't see consistency from state to state about landlord-tenant law, if that makes sense. It's something that's very different as you move around the country. So we call these non-freehold estates. There's a word you haven't heard since like chapter 2. What does the word freehold mean?
Ownership.
Ownership. So a freehold estate is an interest or a legal estate. Remember that word estate? Estate is just a legal interest in property. A freehold interest is an ownership interest. Well, leases are non-freehold interest. That's all it means. When you see that statement, non-freehold, it means lease. That's it. So any non-freehold is a lease. Simple as that. And there are 4 categories of leases. Now, here's what I want to tell you about this. These categories have nothing to do with how rent is paid. These have to do with how the tenancies end. This is all what these categories are not about how we pay the rent. We're going to talk about that separately, because there's different ways we can structure payment of the rent. But one of the most common misunderstandings about leases is that every lease ends in the exact same way. They do not. There are actually 4 different types of ways that a lease could end. So here's what I want you to remember before we get into this. One of these requires notice to end. One of these does not require notice to end. One of them can end at any time with notice from either party. They just decide it's over, it's over. And one of them is breaking the law. Those are the 4 different, and that's why it's 4 very different outcomes, because the truth is, one requires notice to end, one requires no notice to end, one can end at any given time, it doesn't even have a set time period, and one of these is only going to end in court because you're already breaking the law. That's what we're working our way through here. It's not how we're paying the rent, but how we're structuring the breakup. Is everybody good on that? Okay. So the first one is the one that does not require any notice. The estate for years. Estate for years. Now don't let the name fool you. An estate for years just means an estate for a definite period of time. It can be any definite period of time. You could have a 2-month lease that's an estate for years. You could have a 2-week lease that's an estate for years. The key here is that no notice is required when this thing ends. Neither party, whether you're talking about the landlord or the tenant, the lessor or the lessee, and let's go through that real quickly. The OR is the person who's always doing the giving or the receiving. Which one? The giving. The OR person is giving. So in the case of a lessor, you're giving a lease. Whereas the E person is what? Is receiving. They're receiving a lease. So who's the lessor? The landlord or the tenant? The landlord would be the lessor, and the lessee would be the tenant, renter. Is everybody okay on that terminology? So if you see that, don't let that throw you off. You know, just remember, giver is the OR person and the EE person is the one doing the receiving. Any definite period of time. Now, here's what you need to understand. The leases that require notice to terminate are not for definite periods of time. Because the whole idea of a lease requiring notice is that if you don't give notice, it does what? It renews itself. These leases do not renew themselves. These leases do not automatically convert to month. These leases do not just reset and restart just because somebody continues to pay rent. When this lease is over, it is over. And nobody has to give notice to the other party. Now let me ask you a question. Does that sound like a residential lease to you? No. In every residential lease I've ever seen, and matter of fact, in every one you ever will see in North Carolina, both parties have to give what to each other? Notice. If the landlord doesn't want to renew the lease for the tenant, they have to give the tenant a certain amount of notice that they're not going to renew the lease. If the tenant doesn't want to stay past the end of their lease, they have to give notice that they plan to move out, correct? That's not this kind of lease. So a tenancy for years, the biggest differentiating factor, again, is how the thing ends. And this one ends without notice. Here's the idea. You should know when your lease expires. Now, we don't do that to residential tenants because the state, whether you think they're right or wrong, doesn't really matter. This is how the state feels. The state feels that residential tenants are dumb and need protection. So the state doesn't allow residential tenants to go into a lease that just ends without any notice. They say to the landlord, you have to do what for this person? Notify them, give them notice, remind them that their lease is coming up, and let them know that you're not going to renew it. If you have one of these leases, nobody's going to notify you in advance. If they do, they're doing you a favor. They're certainly not required to. These leases are almost always what you would find in commercial settings. Almost all commercial leases are what we call an estate for years. And what that simply means is that when they're over, they're over. There's no automatic renewal. Can you renew them?
Yes.
Sure. So here's the difference. Rather than giving notice that I intend to not renew, what would I need to give notice for here? That I intend to renew, or that I wanted to renew, because the other party doesn't have to allow me to renew. But if I had, like, my lease on this space, you know, if we were coming up and we had 6 months left on our lease in this space, would that be a conversation I would need to be having with the landlord? Yeah, because they don't have to remind me that's coming up for expiration. I would need to recognize myself that that lease is about to expire, that we have to do something. We need to get a new lease in place, or we need to plan to move. That's an estate for years. Don't let the name fool you, as I said before. An estate for years can be for any period of time. Does that make sense? Okay. Any period of time. 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 days. Doesn't matter. Any period of time. No notice. And this is going to be most commercial leases. Now, the one you're much more familiar with is called periodic tenancy. Periodic tenancy is the one that you would have seen and heard much more commonly in most cases. This is the one that most people are familiar with, because this is the one that requires notice. This thing doesn't end. It has to be ended. You have to take action. One of the two parties has to take action. Whether that is the landlord or the tenant, somebody has to say, we don't want this thing to keep going. Could the landlord give notice to the tenant that we don't want to renew your lease? Yes. Could the tenant give notice to the landlord that they don't want to renew their lease? What happens, though, and here's the key difference, what happens if neither one of them give notice to the other? It automatically renews itself. That's a periodic tenancy, or a estate from period to period. It's going to automatically renew itself. So think about those residential leases you've signed over the years. They usually would say, like, for example, the lease is for 1 year, which is where you start going off the rails because you think, oh, that's a definite period, that must be an estate for years. But that's not what makes it a periodic tenancy. What makes it a periodic tenancy is how it ends, because the next statement will be, and you have to give how many days of notice if you want to renew the lease or if you want to terminate. And if you don't give notice, it's going to automatically convert to what? What is that next statement? It's going to convert to month to month. What the lease is telling you is that thing's going to renew itself. It's going to renew itself. That is a periodic tenancy. And in North Carolina, residential leases must be periodic tenancies. You're not allowed by state law in North Carolina to lease a residential property with anything other than a periodic tenancy. So now, could you do a commercial lease with a periodic tenancy? Yes. You can do whatever you want to on commercial. Most commercial leases are not periodic tenancies. Most commercial leases are estates for years. But you could do a commercial lease with this kind of a renewal cycle. You could not do a residential as an estate for years. Everybody good with that? Not in North Carolina anyway. As far as the notice goes, these are North Carolina specific rules. So this is going to be, again, in the state section. This is the minimum notice time frames. Minimum. Now, does it say maximum? Does it say you have to use these notices, this amount of notice? It says this is the minimum. So let me ask you a question. Could your lease between the landlord and tenant specify more notice than what the law says right here?
Yes.
Yes, it just couldn't specify what? Less than these numbers. That's exactly right. So if you have a week-to-week tenancy, the minimum notice time frame is 2 weeks. 2 days. Sorry. Week-to-week, 2 days. Week-to-week's 2 days. Month-to-month, 7 days. So if somebody's on a month-to-month lease, the minimum notice by state law is going to be 7 days. Now here's where people will get confused. I don't think you see this on the test, but I just want you to understand how this works. If I have a written lease for an apartment, and I've leased it for a year, and it says at the end of the lease, if it's not renewed, if nobody gives notice, it converts to month, but in the lease it specifies 30 days notice. It says, okay, so a 1 year lease, the landlord and tenant have to give each other 30 days notice to terminate. At the end of the lease, if it hasn't been renewed, it converts to month. That notice period does not drop down to 7 days just because it converted to month. If the written lease says 30 days notice, how much notice is still required? 30 days. These laws are only there for one of two things: to make sure you don't write a lease that's more strict than this, or number two, if there's no written lease at all. That's a really big point. In sales contracts, we remind you repeatedly that a sales contract must be in what? Writing, in order to be enforceable in a North Carolina court of law. Because the statute of frauds says that about real estate sales contracts. Notice I keep saying real estate sales contracts. The statute of frauds doesn't make any mention whatsoever about real estate lease contracts. And what that means is that a lease can be enforceable even if it's not in what? Writing. You could have an oral lease, and if you do, these are the notice time frames that are. Are there lots of people who rent residential real estate in this state with an oral lease? Unfortunately, there are. Unfortunately, there are. And here's what I mean. They just start paying rent. They're just writing somebody a check every month. They're paying them cash every month, and they never wrote anything down. They never signed anything. I mean, I grew up in the eastern part of the state. I'd say probably half the leases in that part of the state operated in exactly that way. And the thing you need to understand is those are still enforceable leases. The landlord still has the same rights and responsibilities. The tenant still has the same rights and responsibilities. But what you can't do when you have an oral lease is say, oh, well, they're required to give me 30 days notice. Well, if you wanted them to give you 30 days notice, what should you have done? You should have put that in writing. Because if you don't put it in writing, what you're going to get is the state minimums. So if somebody does not, I'll give you an example. If somebody's just paying you rent monthly, what kind of lease do you think the court's going to say you have if you don't have a written lease? Month-to-month, periodic tenancy. So how much notice is the court going to say that either party would need to give? 7 days. Do you see how that works? That's what these minimums are about. It's about setting up a standard so that the court knows what to do when you show up and you don't have a lease, because that could happen. On a year-to-year tenancy, you have to give at least 1 month notice. So you couldn't have a written lease that said less than 1 month notice if it was a year-to-year tenancy. And it doesn't have to automatically renew as the same thing it was before. If it was a 1-year lease, it doesn't have to renew year to year. It can renew month to month. Here's one thing you need to understand about this idea of oral leases, and it's a big one. If you accept rent in this state, and you don't have a written agreement specifying otherwise what that rent is for, the court will always assume that rent is for 1 month, that you intended a month-to-month tenancy. So let's talk about how that could be really dangerous to you as a real estate broker or a property manager, because really that's what we're getting toward here, talking about property management as real estate brokers. If you were a property manager and you had if Omar was leasing a property from me, it's not my property personally, but one I manage, and his lease expired at the end of July, and we had given him the 30 days notice. He knew we were not renewing his lease, and then the 30th of July rolls around, or 31st of July rolls around, and he's not out. And so I go visit the property on the 2nd or 3rd, and he's still not out. And I knock on the door and I say, Omar, what's the deal? You're supposed to be out of here 3 days ago, bud. And he said, well, I just couldn't get moved. I had work this weekend. I couldn't get moved. The movers are coming on Friday. Let me just give you $200 to cover this week. No, 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 no. That's a month. Because if you accept that payment without a written agreement that specifies exactly what it's for, a court will always make the assumption that it's for a what? A month. Not only have you just leased the property to Omar for $200 for the whole month, but you just created a whole new lease, and you have to turn around and give written notice again that you do not intend to renew that lease, because otherwise what's it going to do at the end of the month? It's going to automatically renew itself. A court will say you created a whole brand new lease by accepting that rental payment. So if you want to take the $200 from Omar, you're going to have to go, and remember, you're a real estate broker, so you can't draft contract language. Who would you have to go to? An attorney, and get them to draft some sort of a legal agreement that specifies that the $200 only covers 1 month holdover rent and is not to be construed as a new lease, and yada yada. And the attorney's going to charge you $500 to draft that document so you can accept the $200 rent. So what are you going to say to Omar when he tries to give you the $200? No, sir. You keep it. Get out.
Well, you write up a thing stating clearly, this is, and if you don't get out by the week, $200 is for 1 week.
Can you? No. Not as a real estate broker. Because that's drafting language. That's drafting language. That's what I said. You have to go to an attorney and get them to do it. So the net outcome as a real estate broker is you're just going to say what? No thanks. Mm-mm. Now, if you're the owner of the property and you want to try to draft that on your own yourself, you can take that chance as the owner of the property. But us as real estate brokers, we're not allowed to do that. It's not our thing. We don't get to take that chance.
So I'm managing the property for you. I don't know this specifically.
You tell him no.
Travis, Cal won't take no for an answer. I tried to tell him he wants to do this. We're going to write something up for you. You decide it.
No. You can't write it up.
Go ahead, you write it up.
You can't advise me to write it up. I mean, literally, your only answer is, we can't do anything unless an attorney does this. That's it. Now, if your client insists and says, well, I'll just write something up, you say, fine, and you also send an email that says, I've advised you not to do this, to cover yourself, because otherwise you could be construed as practicing law without a license. And that's really the danger. See, the North Carolina Bar Association doesn't care about the public representing themselves. What they care about is real estate brokers who go into their pool, so to speak. And that happens a lot. One of the big reasons we have to hammer this home in teaching it is that real estate brokers are notorious for doing this. They are notorious for, and they think they're the smartest people. They think just because they put words like whereas and herewith that they all of a sudden are a damn attorney. Like I've read some of the stuff I've read, you'd laugh your rear end off about what it actually says versus what they thought it said. And I always love, you see somebody who, they got a GED and here they are writing, Tom Smith, hereinafter known as buyer. I'm like, you don't even know what hereinafter means, much less how to appropriately use it in that document. Just stop and go get an attorney. And so it's something we have to constantly hammer home. Everybody good on this? Month to month is the default. So don't accept partial rent payments because you'll end up with a month-to-month lease. All right, so we've covered so far 2 of these different. Remember, we said these 4 types were all about how the lease does what? How it ends. What is the ultimate end of the lease? And we said the first one we talked about was one that did not require any notice. That is tenancy for years, or the estate from year to year, right? The estate for years, sorry. And then the second one requires notice, which is the periodic tenancy, or from year to year, month to month, whatever. That's a periodic tenancy. The third one, if you'll recall, I said was one in which either party could end it at any time with no notice. They don't have any bind to each other. So first of all, do you think there's going to be a enforceable lease in place here? No. Because if there was an enforceable lease in place here, the last thing they could do is just walk out at any given time, right? An estate at will is just permission to stay there. It's permission to be there. But it's not binding. Because what can you do with your permission at any given time? You can take it away. Permission is a very temporary thing. So the owner of the property is simply given permission to a tenant to stay there. Here's the difference between an estate at will and a real lease. These 2 parties have no legal responsibility to each other. There's nothing enforceable between the 2 of them. So the landlord doesn't owe anything to the tenant, and the tenant does not owe anything to the landlord. And when I say the tenant does not owe anything to the landlord, I mean anything. What normally would a tenant owe to a landlord? Rent. The tenant doesn't owe the landlord rent. Could they choose to pay them something if they wanted to? Sure. But they don't owe them. Because as soon as the landlord says, I'm going to take you to court, you owe me rent, the court's going to go, well, then this is not an estate at will. If you're trying to enforce this thing, if you're trying to say they owe you something, then it's either got to be an estate for years or a periodic tenancy. Does that make sense for everybody? So an estate at will is literally just, it's like a handshake deal. You stay there, it's fine, whatever. If you leave tomorrow, that's all right too. That's an estate at will. But there's nothing binding about this arrangement. What does that look for?
When would this happen?
Happens all the time. You never met a redneck, apparently.
That's so true.
It does. They show up on a Tuesday and leave on a Saturday.
At your house?
Let me just give you a, well, their house is their cousin's house, is the one they're renting from their grandma, is their, I'm telling you, there are a lot of transient people in this world. So you have to realize that there are just a ton of people, and I joke at the expense of rednecks because I are one, so I can do that, right? You know, but the truth is there are a lot of transient people who do these kinds of things, who just stay with somebody for a couple of weeks or stay with the next person. And here's what happens. So you hear about this all the time, you know, in TV shows. You don't really understand what they're talking about. How many of you have ever heard like squatters' rights and all these kinds of things, and people go into court and claiming they have a lease and they have the, that's what this is all about. It's about preventing that. It's basically saying we understand that these 2 people have an arrangement with each other, but we also understand that there is no binding about it. If that person, if somebody moves into your house with you as an estate for will, at will, and they give you a couple $100 in rent, that was a favor they did for you because they didn't owe you anything. Because as soon as you start using the phrasing, they owe me this, you just gave them all the legal rights as a tenant. See, it's normally the landlord who messes this up. If this ends up in court, it's normally the landlord who screws up. Because if he ends up in court, it's undoubtedly about somebody who thinks somebody owes them money. Does that make sense with you guys? So you'll have 2 people living together. And one will sue the other and say, well, they didn't pay their share of the electric bill. They didn't pay their share of the rent. So I told them to get out. Well, see, those 2 things don't go together. Because if they had a share of the electric bill, if they had a share of the rent, you don't have the right to tell them to get out because they're a tenant. Does that make sense?
So this is more of your own home. Like if you invite somebody into your own home.
Or it could be just a property you own.
Like if you have a beach house and you're like, hey, you guys can go stay whenever you want. And
That's
they
it.
go and
That's an
stay.
estate at will.
Oh God, they've been there for a month. Like maybe they really are just gonna stay there.
So you can tell them to get out.
Okay.
You can tell them to get out. But here's the thing. If you say, no, you owe me $1,000,
For rent.
Okay.
it's not an estate at will anymore, because what you've done is created an agreement. And what does the state say that agreement's going to be if you don't have it in writing? It's month to month. So that family that said you tell them they can use your beach house, but they got to pay you $1,000, and you think it's for a week, you just rented it to them for a month.
So that's a periodic tenancy.
That's a periodic tenancy, month to month.
You just converted it.
You created one by creating the expectation. The thing to understand with an estate at will, it's okay if money gets exchanged, but there can't be the expectation of money being exchanged, because once you create expectations, and expectations work both ways. Is that kind of registering with you? The truth is, the law really frowns on this sort of a relationship. Because the way the law views this is, if you expected him to pay something, you should have had a lease. You should have written a lease. If there was an expectation, you should have made that clear. Don't do these. So, that help? You good?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So it could be any property you own where you basically give somebody permission. I can give you an example of when you might want to do this, when this might be advantageous. And it ties in with something we're going to talk about later. Later in the chapter, we're going to talk about the fact that as a residential landlord, when you lease residential property in this state, you have certain expectations to maintain the property in a fit and habitable condition. What if the property is not in a fit and habitable condition? You don't want to lease it to somebody, because then they can immediately sue you and force you. What if you got your grandparents' house that was built in 1905 and it doesn't have central heat? All it's got is space heaters, and so you let somebody move in because it's sitting there empty. Can you do that? Sure. Can they pay you a few $100s a month if they want to? Absolutely. Can you say to them, you owe me $500 for staying here this month? No. Because as soon as you make that statement, it's no longer an estate at will, it's a periodic tenancy. And now, because you put an expectation on them of paying rent, they put an expectation on you of, I need heat, I need working plumbing, I need all these things, and you legally are obligated to go fix them. So there are times when this could be to your advantage as a property owner, when it would just be better to say, listen, or how about, have you ever heard of people that say, well, they're just fixing the place up. I'm not charging them rent, they're just fixing the place up. Some people do that.
People do that.
People do that a lot. That's an estate at will. Because if you create the expectation, well, you can only stay here as long as you fix this, this, and this, and this, the state's going to say that's a lease. And the state's going to say they shouldn't be fixing it. The landlord should be fixing it. You see what I mean? So there are requirements that go along with becoming a landlord that the estate at will doesn't have, because it's very clear that neither party is responsible to the other one. You don't like it, you leave. I don't like it, I tell you to get out. Simple as that. And neither party can do that at any time.
And if you mess up and make it periodic tenancy, you give a week notice.
At least a week notice, right? Put it on minimum. That's right. Okay? And then finally, the one that's illegal, the estate at sufferance. So we talked about one that didn't require notice, one that did require notice, one that anybody could end it at any given time, and then finally we're at the trespasser. And I call them the trespasser, even though that's not really what they are, but it's pretty dang close. These are people who were supposed to be out, but won't what? Won't leave. It's called an estate at sufferance. The only difference between this person and the trespasser is that the trespasser never had the right to be there legally in the first place, whereas this person at one point did have a lease. They just won't leave. They've overstayed their welcome. We also sometimes call them a holdover tenant. That's the other terminology for them. They're called a holdover tenant.
Where do we see that?
Holdover tenant could show up as a terminology. The tenant holds over. It could show up. I mean, it's a fair game terminology. Whether it does or not, it's hard to say, but it's fair game that it would show up. Because that's technically the term. Generally speaking, we don't call them holdover tenants in residential leases, but in commercial a lot. If you go into commercial real estate and they talk to you about a tenant that was supposed to be out that doesn't get out, they always call them a holdover tenant. That's how they'll, and in fact, sometimes they do that with a wink, wink, nod, nod, and everybody's okay with it. You know, like for example, commercial real estate's odd. I mean, it's very different. It's a different world than residential real estate is. Like if I own this building, for example, and I'm trying to sell this building, and I know that the person who's interested in buying this building wants a certain space available. They don't want it occupied with a long-term lease. I know they want that space available, but I've got a tenant in that space right now who's paying good rent. Everybody with me? So on one hand, I'm trying to negotiate the sale of the building, and I know the buyer wants that unit vacant. They want it for their office space. If they buy the building, they're going to use that one unit as their office, and they've expressed that interest to me. They're like, I'd rather that space not be leased. I've got a tenant in that space who's paying rent. They're a great tenant. If it was up to me, I'd renew their lease, no problem. But I'm trying to do what with the building? I'm trying to sell it. I'm trying to satisfy this buyer so we can come to an arrangement. So the tenant calls me and says, what are we going to do? My lease is up next month. I'm going to say, just keep paying. Just keep paying. So when I call and I talk to the buyer's going to say, well, what's the deal with this space? You know, you told me that space is going to be empty. I'd say, oh, no, they're a holdover tenant. So you can get rid of them at any time. They're just a holdover. Does that make sense? That's how we would refer to them. And so what that message conveys to the buyer is that they can do what with that tenant at any time? Get rid of them, because they don't have a legal right to be there. So sometimes you intentionally have holdover tenants in commercial real estate. Because if you're the owner of the building, you don't want to vacate the unit. You'd rather them continue to pay rent, but at the same time, you don't want to lease it out and kill your sales deal on the other side. So you just sort of, everybody's like, nod, nod, wink, wink. You keep paying, you keep staying, right? And you just refer to them as a holdover tenant.
And I wonder if their lease is a 7-year lease.
Well, if it's not up, it's got to be, going to have to honor it.
That was the key there.
That it was coming up, that's right. That the lease was coming up. That's exactly right. Okay, everybody good with that terminology? Holdover? Now, let's talk about payment structures of leases. And I know this stuff is not exciting at all, but you got to know it. Those 4 categories we just went through are the structures of how leases end. These payment structures have nothing to do. In other words, you could have a periodic tenancy that's structured in a bunch of different ways as far as how the rent's paid. So they're 2 different things, right? A lease is going to be an estate for years, and then it's going to have a payment structure, and they're 2 separate things. Don't think that one automatically ties to the other. Is everybody with me on that? So one details how the lease ends. The other, which is what we're about to talk about now, details how the rent gets paid, how the rent is structured on this thing. Now, the most common type of payment structure in a lease is called a gross lease. What does the word gross mean compared to net? Before, let's just not say taxes, let's expand that word out. Taxes are a type of an expense. So before what? Before deductions or expenses. Gross means before expenses are deducted. Net means after expenses. Think of the seller net math we did in chapter number 9, right? Or chapter 8, sorry. The seller net math we did in chapter 8 was all about how much a seller was going to net after paying off their mortgage balance and their commissions and all that sort of thing. So it's after expenses are deducted is a net, whereas a gross is before any expenses are deducted. This is the most common way rent payments are structured in North Carolina, is with a gross lease payment. What that means is that the tenant pays one amount and one amount only to the landlord. And all of the expenses associated with owning and operating that property are the landlord's responsibility. So they get a gross lease payment because their money that comes in is before any of the expenses have been deducted. So give me examples of expenses you would expect a landlord to have to pay before they can put the lease money in their pocket. What money are they going to have to deduct out of that? Property taxes. Okay, what else? Maintenance expenses, insurance expenses. How about if they have hired a property manager? Would that be an expense that would have to come out of that, right? So there's a significant number of expenses that would come out of that. So if the landlord is getting $1,500 a month in rent, that's really not an accurate portrayal of how much money they're making off the property. Does that make sense for everybody? And here's the other thing, and this is the reason that some landlords look for a different structure, especially in longer term leases. Could those expenses we just rattled through change over time? Absolutely. Could property taxes go up year to year? Could maintenance expenses become more expensive over time, especially as a property ages? No question. Insurance could become more expensive. In this type of lease, the landlord is taking most of the risk because the tenant knows exactly how much they're going to pay every month, but the landlord does not know exactly how much they're going to have left over. Could they have a month where they make no money? Hell, for that matter, could they have 4 or 5 months in a row where they make no money? If an HVAC system blows up on a residential property, you could easily have a 6-month period where you have negative cash flow just to recoup the money for the HVAC system. Does that make sense for everybody? So the risk is all with the landlord with a gross lease payment because they've got to worry about the expenses after the fact. The landlord might want to do it differently. They might want something called a net lease. In a net lease, well, we said gross means before expenses are deducted, so what does net mean? After expenses are deducted. So what do you think's happening here? The tenant's obviously still paying rent, but who's responsible for all those expenses? The tenant is. The tenant is. It's not the landlord who's paying the property taxes on the property, it's the tenant. It's not the landlord who's paying the insurance on the property, it's the tenant. It's not the landlord who's paying for maintenance on the property, it's the tenant. So when that $6,000 HVAC unit blows up, guess who gets to replace it? The tenant does. This type of payment structure is not allowed in residential leases. What do you think residential leases have to be? They have to be gross. And one of the main reasons is that in a residential lease in North Carolina, the landlord is required to provide maintenance of the property. So maintenance has to be a landlord expense in North Carolina for residential leases. So what do you think you see, where do you think you see net leases used? In commercial real estate. The vast majority of commercial leases are net leases, or sometimes we simply refer to them as a triple net lease, because usually there are 3 expenses specifically that have been transferred to the tenant. If you ever look at a commercial lease, you may see something called TICAM, T-I-C-A-M. That stands for Taxes, Insurance, and Common Area Maintenance. Taxes, insurance, common area maintenance. And so the way what you would see when you look at the price, the lease price of that property, you would see the net lease number, which is one number, and then you would see a separate expense, which is an estimated expense for TICAM. What that means is that the lease number is locked in, but the TICAM number could do what? Could change. If the maintenance all of a sudden goes up astronomically, that just gets passed along to the tenant. Now, for practical purposes, we usually don't make the actual replacement the tenant's responsibility, just the payment for the replacement. If you're the landlord, you probably don't want to say to the tenant, you got to replace that air conditioning unit, because what would happen is they never would. They would put Band-Aids on it, they would, So what you do is you estimate, here's your taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance expense estimate for the year, but if we have to do a major replacement, what will we do with this number? We will increase it, we will change it. So that's the thing to know about commercial leasing is the amount you're paying is not really locked in. The part you pay for the rent is locked in, but the taxes, insurance, and maintenance part could change, and it can change dramatically. Everybody okay with that? Who's taking the risk in this one, relatively speaking, landlord or tenant? The tenant is. Tenant's taking the risk in this one because the tenant's number is the one that could fluctuate. The landlord's number never changes because the landlord's going to get that same rental amount. So like for example, if you looked up commercial space in Raleigh right now, depending on the type of commercial space, your parents have probably done this with a restaurant, depending on the type of commercial space you look for, you might find something that, you see something that looks like this in the listing. $17 per square foot plus $3.75 TICAM. So how much is the tenant actually going to be paying per square foot? $20.75, because this is also a per square foot number. So the tenant's actually going to be paying $20.75, but here's the one thing the tenant needs to recognize. The only one of those two numbers that's locked in is this one, because this one can do what? This one can go up or down. Presumably they never do, but it can change. It can change. So, but when you're actually figuring how much you're going to be paying, you have to figure $20.75 because that's the minimum you're going to be paying, and you need to give some flex room because it could go up from there if that TICAM expense changes. And by the way, those numbers are annualized numbers. So when you look at a triple net lease amount, that $17 per square foot is per square foot per year. That's how you would calculate the lease amount. So like for example, if you were leasing a 4,000 square foot space, you would say $4,000 times $20.75 a month is $83,000 a year divided by 12. That's $6,917 a month in rent. I'm sorry.
So that's a gross?
It's a net lease, but that's the total amount because it took into account both of these.
So with the $3.75, with the net, they are, the tenant is responsible for making those changes. So is that $3.75 included, or say the air conditioning unit breaks down, they have to pay for that, or is that the $3.75?
No, that $3.75 includes estimates for those expenses. So in that $3.75, the landlord is estimating how much the expenses will be for taxes, insurance, and maintenance. But the key here is if there's a major expense, they're going to roll that major expense into this number. So that number can change at any given time. So if they have to replace the HVAC system, you may get a notice from the landlord, your TICAM just went up to $4.25 a square foot from now on.
Okay, gotcha.
And so from that point forward, your rent's not 17 plus 375, it's 17 plus 425 per square foot. And that's the way they handle it. The key thing here is the landlord doesn't get to quote unquote keep this money. This money has to go into an escrow account. This money has to go into escrow to pay the taxes, to pay the insurance. But the landlord is getting a consistent $17 a square foot every single month, because if there's not enough money to cover the maintenance, they're simply going to raise this charge up to satisfy it. So in that regard, the tenant's paying for all of those things rather than the landlord. See, the nice thing about a residential lease is you don't really care if the whole thing blows up and goes to hell, right? Because it's the landlord's responsibility to pay for that. I mean, I feel sorry for some landlords because they don't realize what they're getting into when they lease a property. Some people inherit a property and it's in horrible shape. And the first thing they think they should do is rent it out. And they end up spending more in maintenance than they're taking it in rent. Sometimes it's best just to let it sit empty. Because once you rent it in North Carolina for residential purposes, you don't get to say, well, I don't want to fix that, because the law requires you to. Doesn't say you have to make every repair, but pretty extensive list of things that have to be done. Everybody okay on the difference between a gross lease and a net lease? So most residential leases are going to, in fact, all residential leases are going to be gross leases. Most commercial leases are going to be net leases. Everybody all right on that? Now, you're getting to the less common type of commercial leases, the percentage lease. It's also known as a retail lease. Why do you think we call it a retail lease? Where do you think it's used? What kind of property? Retail. It's used in retail. Shopping malls, in particular, use this. And I'm not talking about strip shopping centers, but I'm talking about the dying dinosaur, right? The actual indoor mall. Crabtree Valley leases on a percentage basis. What that means is that the tenant has two different lease payments. One is what they call their base lease amount. Their rent never goes below that base amount. The second, and usually the much bigger payment, is a percentage of their sales every month. So that the landlord gets a percentage of the gross sales done by the tenant in that store over the course of the month. There's a very valid reason for having this as your rental setup. If you're a tenant and you're leasing space in Crabtree Valley Mall, do you want the mall to do things like decorate for holidays and have the Easter Bunny out there or Santa Claus or have, different events? Do advertising on television? Do you want the mall to do all those kinds of things? Well, see, the only way the mall is going to do all those kinds of things is if the mall makes more money as a result of doing those kinds of things. The mall only makes more money as a result of doing those kinds of things because more people shop at the mall and the mall is getting a percentage of those sales. Does that make sense? So this is done to incentivize the landlord to market the property, to try to drive traffic to the property. It's also done from the tenant's perspective to help them pay rent when they can most afford it and pay a lot less when they can least afford it. What you might find is that in some retail settings, maybe 30 to 40% of the tenant's total rent for the year is paid in the month of December. Because think about when they do their sales. And then compare what their rent would be in December to what their rent would be in January. Because in January, do you know that the vast majority of retailers actually have negative sales numbers for the month of January? You know how that's possible? Returns. Returns. January is a bloodbath in the retail industry. So think about if you're structuring your leases, wouldn't it make sense if you've got those little kiosks out there in the mall, you might rent that thing to that, whatever they're selling, cell phones or the stupid, ties with the LED lights on them, all that, all that mess. They sell the little, I'm not talking about the big stores, I'm talking about the stuff right down in the middle of the hallways. If you're renting one of those kiosks that sell sunglasses or hair care products or whatever, as the mall, you might rent them that kiosk for as little as $500 a month. That's their base rent. But then you might charge them 15% of their sales. Because what you know is that in the month of December, they're probably going to do, even at one of those little kiosks, they're probably going to do $50,000 or $60,000 in sales in the month of December. And so in the month of December, you're going to get $10,000, $12,000 in rent off of that kiosk. What are you going to get in January? That base $500. That's all. And so it's a way to just balance the money better in a retail setting. That's the reason they use these kinds of leases in retail.
Who pays the taxes?
I'm sorry?
Who pays the taxes?
Who pays the property taxes?
Yeah.
That would be the landlord. That would be the landlord. All the expenses are, so in that sense it's like a gross lease, except the amount is based on your sales. Now, for this to work, there has to be a pretty close relationship between the landlord and the tenant. Like in the case of Crabtree, for example, everybody who owns a store in there has to tie into their point of sale management system. In other words, when you sell it, they know it. So when Belk makes a sale in there, not only does Belk and their corporate office know it, but the owners of Crabtree Valley Mall know it because they're getting a percentage. And obviously for your big anchor stores, the percentages are much smaller, but the numbers are much bigger. I think Belk's at Crabtree is 3%. I think that's what Crabtree gets. I don't know what their base rental amount is because they don't publicize that, but I think their percentage is 3%, and I think the kiosks range anywhere from 15 to 25. So that just shows you the dramatic difference between the smaller fish and the big fish in a place like that. But of course, 3% of Belk's sales is a heck of a lot more than 25% of one of those kiosks. So
they also range, the percentages range from, I guess, unit to unit. I don't know.
they do. They're negotiated. Each lease is negotiated individually, right? So even if you own one of the kiosks and say you've been there for 5 or 6 years and you have a really good sales history, you might renegotiate your lease down from 25% to 15% because they see that 15% of your sales is better than 25% on some of the other ones that they have. So yeah, they're all, and these are intense negotiations to, you know, when they come up for renewal about what those percentages are. Generally speaking, the newer you are, the less of a track record you have, the higher that percentage is going to be. The base lease is usually the same for everybody. Usually the mall will just have $1 per square foot, this is the base lease amount. It's the percentage part that's the big negotiating factor.
So what, Triangle Town Center's going out of business?
Triangle Town Center's going out of business because they don't have any business. I mean, it's in such an odd location for an indoor shopping mall. You know, nobody is going to stop off of 540 to go shop at the mall. Nobody driving north or south on 1 has time to stop at the mall. And nobody who isn't already in that area wants to put themselves in that traffic nightmare to deal with that mall. And that's ultimately the thing that's killing it. It's not in enough of a residential area to be a draw just in and of itself. It's much more of an industrial type area. And they just don't have the natural traffic patterns that would normally feed a major shopping facility like that. I mean, like for example, if you look at the two in our area that are thriving, you look at Crabtree, well, North Hills now too. With North Hills is a different thing though, really. I mean, you know, that's a whole different type of development. But of the traditional malls, Crabtree and South Point are the two traditional ones, you know, mall model. And both are thriving, and they're both surrounded by residential spaces. And that's the thing. So they have a built-in audience with those, you know, with the residential people, and that's what keeps them flowing. You know, Triangle Town Center just doesn't have that. I mean, you have to like make a trip to go to Triangle Town Center. So, Cary Town Center is a mess. It's just a mess. The thing with Cary Town Center is it is dying as a result of being too close to both Crabtree and South Point. I mean, it's about halfway between the two of them, and it's just far less desirable to shop at than either of the two, just because of the selection of stores and that sort of thing. But malls in general, Crabtree and South Point are the exception nationally. Malls in general are dying. That is a very, and if you notice, even at Crabtree, one of the reasons they have been able to maintain for so long is they've evolved. I mean, that mall has changed tremendously. I mean, it is very, yes, they still have a very large indoor mall presence, but look how much of that's been turned to the outside. You know, see, I remember when you went to Crabtree and you pulled in that main entrance up at the front, there was nothing on the front of that building. It was just brick wall, and you had to actually go in the main entrance to get to anything. Now, all the way from Sears, all the way down to the other end at Belk, they've turned those, they have, you know, front-facing stores now, so that you can actually, those stores actually have entrances from the sidewalk. And so there's been a definite change, and the malls that have evolved have done okay. The ones that have not, and they're falling hard. It used to be, you know, the mall was a destination in and of itself. You know, kids of my generation, we didn't have anywhere else to go, so we went to the mall and walked up and down the mall. I probably walked 8,000 miles in Carolina East Mall in Greenville, North Carolina, because we didn't have anything else to do, you know. Now it's just that's not the draw, you know, and as, you know, brick and mortar stores kind of die out, it's become much more about the experience with food. You know, malls are much more food centric than they ever were, and that's another thing that Crabtree has really done on an innovation side. I mean, look at the new construction. I mean, when they started building, they didn't build stores, they built restaurants. They built McCormick and Schmidt's, they built Brio. They converted a lot of what was, you know, they put Cheesecake Factory in what was an old retail space. They put, you know, I mean, they you know, the Con-Key was always there, but they put an entrance straight from the outside where you didn't have to go into the mall. You know, then P.F. Chang came with an exterior, you know, so now malls have become places where the ones that are successful, let's go eat, and the restaurant you happen to want to go to is there, so you do some shopping at the mall while you're also there. I'm one of those people, you got to pay me almost to get me to go to Crabtree. I mean, whew, God, that place, it tears my nerves all to pieces getting in and out of there. I mean, it just, you know, and the thing of it is, it's a nice mall. I don't mind it once I'm actually in there, but that whole Glenwood disaster area right there. It's just such a mess to get in and out of. And our offices used to be right over there, and for the month before Christmas, it was just horrible. I mean, and when it snowed, it took me, when we had the Snowmageddon day, our office was right there in Oak Park, which is right down the street from Crabtree Valley Mall. And no lie, from Oak Park, which is about a mile past Crabtree, to get there back to 440 took me 4 hours that day. I thought, that was you remember the memes where they had like the Star Wars, and the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, and cars on fire, and it was that bad. I mean, it was legitimately that bad. It was horrible, horrible, for 3 inches of snow. But yeah, that retail leases are much less common now than they used to be, just as shopping malls die out. Most of your strip centers do not use retail leases, and here's the reason. This requires a really sort of expensive overhead system for the owner of the shopping center, because you have to monitor what they're selling. You have to be tied in. If you have just a little strip mall, do you really want to be auditing their books every month to see how much they actually sold? And so, it's pretty usually just a mall thing with the retail leases. Full service leases are, probably the last type of payment structure that we haven't talked about. This space is leased on a full service basis. Full service, the best way I can think of to describe it to you is think of a hotel, but not just in the way you lease a hotel. When you pay at a hotel, you've paid an all-inclusive price, right? Your utilities are included, your television's included, the telephone's included, usually the internet's included, all of those things. Full service leases are most commonly done with office space, where the tenant pays one amount to the landlord, and that is inclusive of everything. Like, for example, we don't have an electric bill in this suite. We don't have a water bill. We don't pay for janitorial service. That's all included in that one lease amount. So obviously, because all of those things are included, how do you think a full service lease price stacks up against the pricing of other lease structures? It's going to be dramatically more expensive. Full service leases are by far the most expensive type of lease structure, and that's why they generally only happen in office space. Because if you think about it, it would be really not fun if you had an office building where you've got 4 different companies on the same floor, and they're all separately paying for electric and water and all that kind of thing, because you would have that one person who was the Nazi about turning the lights off all the time, and so the lights would be off in their section of the hallway half the day. And then you'd have the slobs at the other end of the hallway who would never take out their trash, right? And so they'd have boxes piled in the hallway. And it would be to the detriment of the whole building. So with office space, because you have so many different tenants sharing the same spaces, generally they're leased as full service so they can maintain kind of a consistent level of things across the board. Obviously, this is the most risky for the landlord, because you talk about, having to control expenses. When the tenant didn't even pay their own electric bill, what's the risk you run of things? And forget the lights. Them things right there, that air conditioning. Because you get somebody who have a hot flash and they set a thermostat on 60 degrees and go home for a 10-day weekend. Happens all the time in full. So what you find is that full service leases are like the early adopters of like automation systems. When you go in buildings and the bathrooms have the lights that come on and go off with sensors when you go in there, and the sinks with the automatic faucets and all that stuff, and you think, God, how could they ever pay? I mean, how can you recoup the money you save? You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised. Because you'd be surprised, even like the sinks like we have, how many times I walk in there and the damn sink's just on. Like I walk in the bathroom and who knows how long it's been running. It might have been an hour before somebody, and I don't know how you wash your hands and just forget to turn the water off, just and leave. But that's, so when you see a building that has all of those sort of savings features, it's most likely a full service building, because the landlord is investing in keeping, like all these thermostats are programmable. These things at 11 o'clock at night, they go to 80 degrees no matter what, during the summer, and during the winter they go down to 60. And I don't blame them for that, because The truth is, when I leave at 10 o'clock at night, the last thing I'm thinking about is turning the thermostat up. And you know why I'm not thinking about it? Because I'm not paying the electric bill. If I was paying the electric bill, I'd probably remember. Heck, if I was paying the electric bill, I'd probably be the one to install the smart thermostats myself so it wouldn't happen. So it's definitely a risky thing for the landlord. You have to be really good at controlling expenses to do these full service leases. Okay, everybody good on that? Last thing, and then we'll take a little break here, a ground lease. A ground lease is something that tends to throw people for a little bit of a loop because you don't usually think of this type of transaction. Most of the time, if we see somebody building constructing a building an improvement on a property, we make the assumption that they own the land. That is not necessarily true. That is not always true. It is not required that you own the land in order to build a building there. You could build or construct a building on land that you lease. If you do that, though, aren't you taking a very big risk as a tenant? Because you just spent a ton of money on land that you do not own. And so at the end of the lease, who's probably going to own all that stuff you just constructed? The landlord is. So what kind of lease, as far as time frame, do you think you'd want to have before you'd make this kind of an investment? Very long. It is not uncommon to see ground leases for 99 years. Most cell phone towers, for example, are ground leases. They don't buy that land, they lease that land and then construct the cell phone tower, but they're usually very long-term leases. This company is notorious for having built their fortunes on the ground lease. Contrary to popular opinion, they do not make money selling hamburgers. That is like number 7 on their list of revenue streams. The person who owns that franchise location makes their money selling hamburgers. But these people right here, McDonald's Inc., they make their money from ground leases. Here's their business model. When you come to them and you want to open a McDonald's franchise, the first thing they tell you is write us a check for $350,000. That's step 1. Step 2 is show us where you'd like to put your restaurant. Now, this is the franchisee who's doing all this work, you understand. So the franchisee has to show proposals for where they plan to place the restaurant. If McDonald's agrees that that's a good location for the property, for the store, then McDonald's will buy the land. Not the franchisee, but McDonald's. McDonald's will then turn around and lease that land back to the franchisee, usually for a 20-year period. Who do you think pays to build the store? The tenant, the franchisee does. Why do you think McDonald's only does 20 years? Well, let me ask the question another way. Compare how often Burger King stores get renovated and updated compared to McDonald's stores. Which one happens more often? McDonald's. Compare it to Hardee's or Taco Bell or any fast food, because McDonald's does it with that lease. See, when that lease is coming up for renewal, McDonald's says, yeah, we'd love to renew your lease, but you need about $3 million worth of renovations on this building. This is not our current scheme. This is not our current floor plan. This is not our current kitchen. So they force the lessee to renovate that store, or they terminate their lease. And that lease says if your lease is terminated, the building and all the improvements belong to who? To the landlord, which is, of course, McDonald's. And then McDonald's will sell that franchise location to somebody else, but they're not selling the land, they're simply selling them the location, and then they'll lease it to them for 20 years only if they'll come in and spend the $2-3 million upfitting that location. That's where they make their money. They make it off the ground leases. They make far more money off of real estate than they ever will hamburgers. That's the genius of Ray Kroc. It's also the evil of Ray Kroc, depending on how you look at the man, you know.
Did you see that movie, The Tenant?
I have seen that movie. It's a great movie. And I always taught it this way even before I saw that, and I'm like, you know, it's a very entertaining movie if you've not seen it. So, and pretty accurate historically too. The founder, I enjoyed it. Michael Douglas was, not Michael Douglas, who? Yes.
He did Batman.
Batman, that's right. He was really good. He was really good. And that's a pretty accurate portrayal of what Ray Kroc did too. Yeah.
I saw the live videos at the end.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My dad, he's got some land that he leases too for a tower. That's what I really plan on doing with my real estate.
Ground leases is not a bad way to
Some
go.
houses, but I want to own property and lease it. That's my
Yep.
goal.
All right, let's go ahead and take your first break. Why don't you come back in like 10 minutes and I will grade Josh's midterm. And, well, I haven't told anybody yet. And then I'll print out. That's going to squeal.